We are going to start recording now. Okay. And then throughout our session, yay! Throughout our session, you are free to submit your questions to Bridget or myself in the Q&A section down below. So you just hit that Q&A button and submit your question. And we're going to answer all questions at the end of the session, but you can put your question in at any time during the webinar, just in case you don't want to forget. So put your questions, please put them in that Q&A section, but again, you can put it at any time. And then, so the way this is going to go is I'm going to introduce Bridget. She's going to give us a presentation on some of her work. And then I'm going to show us on the hub where we can also find this information. If you want more details, you want access to her studies, etc. And then we will open up for questions. So thank you so much for being here. We have a wonderful Bridget Donaldson, who is really just incredibly integral to the work we do here at Wild Virginia. She helped start and now helps lead the Virginia Safe Wildlife Corridors Collaborative with myself. And she is working for the Virginia Transportation Research Council and doing just amazing research across the state on wildlife crossings, potential ones to get them in place, or actually putting exclusionary fencing up, which we'll hear about today, to existing underpasses to make sure that they're used actually by wildlife. So we're going to hear a diverse amount of her research on habitat connectivity in Virginia, how it got started and some of its purposes, and then how we can use it in the future to ask for more of those in Virginia, because we are still 9th in the nation for wildlife vehicle conflict. Not great, but a lot of the work that Bridget does is incredible and helps reduce that number. And a lot of this, again, all this information that she's going to talk about is on our Virginia's Habitat Connectivity Hub, which I'll link in the chat for you guys. And then, yeah, I'll show you where we can find this information. But again, Bridget is just such an amazing partner of ours, and we're so happy to have her with us today. So take it away, Bridget.
All right. Wow, that made me feel really good. Thank you so much. All right, I'm going to share my screen. And let me know when you can see my slide. All right. Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I'm excited to talk to everybody today. Wild Virginia, it has been immensely impactful in this area. And at the end of the presentation, I'll get to more specifics about why that is and how impactful they are. And folks like you that listen in and contribute, kind of add a voice to this topic is more important than you may realize. So I'm with the Virginia Transportation Research Council, which is the research division of Virginia DOT. And so we're slightly separate. We're still integrated into everything VDOT. I'm a VDOT employee. But a lot of the folks I work with are also professors at UVA. We work on UVA grounds and are affiliated with much of the engineering school for the most part. But I'm an environmental research scientist and have been here for 21 years now, which is hard to imagine. So this is just the outline of things I'll be talking about. The background of our crash situation with wildlife. And then I'm diving into the data because that's really the reason we're able to do the things that we do and the reason we need to do more things. And then the specific wildlife crossing research. I have one slide on the Wildlife Corridor Action Plan, although you may have already heard presentations about that. And if we have time, and Jess, you'll have to give me like a 5-minute warning when my time's up, but I do also have some information on this really cool reintroduced elk population in Southwest Virginia and some wildlife crossing research that we recently wrapped up with that. So I probably don't have to tell you this particular crowd of folks, but roads are an issue for wildlife. If they're not directly impacting their populations through direct mortality, car crashes, they often serve as a barrier to wildlife movement. And so when we talk about habitat connectivity, the way we can connect habitat across roads is really only with wildlife crossings, unless you get rid of the road altogether. And that's why we'll be diving into that. But there's a lot of animals large enough to cross the road and just don't make it, or there's certain ones that so many have been hit that they're actually their populations have been impacted. So because I'm with VDOT, I have attacked this whole topic through every driver safety angle as possible. So even though I'm going to be talking a lot about deer, just realize that any kind of wildlife crossing structure that is large enough for deer can be used by really almost any other species. But it's just that deer get VDOT's attention because it is a driver safety issue. Same with bear to some extent, but we just don't have good bear crash data. But Virginia is one of the worst states. We're always in the top 10 in terms of animal vehicle collisions, and most of those are deer, with about over 60,000 per year in Virginia. And so what's the issue with data here? Police data is really just not nearly as good as it should be. And the reason for that is probably a lot of you have hit a deer, and most of you have probably not called the police when you hit one because you weren't hurt. There was no reason to. So only 1 in 5 to 1 in 10 deer crashes are even reported to the police. And we have insurance claims data, like State Farm does this great data. They push data out every year, but we don't have locations on where those crashes are because it's private. They can't give that out. So that's not very useful when it comes to finding out where these crashes are happening. So so several years ago, I started really looking at the comparison of, all right, what's the difference if we were to track every animal carcass that VDOT removes from the roads? And that sounds easy. It's not that easy to get VDOT to do that. We've made some headway, which I'll talk about in a second. But I was asked many years ago, maybe 10 years ago now, to look into the stretch of road between Charlottesville and Afton Mountain, which is towards Waynesboro, because that was a huge driver safety issue. And deer were in the top 3 crash types of all the crash types from the police report data. So VDOT thought, that's pretty bad. Bridget, can you help us figure out what to do about it? So in that section, we averaged about 1 to 2 deer crashes per mile every year between that section of Charlottesville to Afton. When I started collecting deer carcass removal data from the contractor, so I would just have the contractors send me their handwritten records of the animals they removed, we had 5 to 9 times more records than we had from police report data. I did this in other counties for other small projects and found the exact same thing. We also valued crashes. This is another really important part of the issue, is how much is a deer crash? And so using VDOT's method of valuing crashes based on the severity of the crash, we came up with a value of 41,000. And so when you look at the real number of crashes, multiply 60,000 times 41,000, that's a really, really big number. And that's something that you can get VDOT to listen to, because they have to value crashes when they're weighing it against the costs of mitigation. We don't currently track carcass removals across the state. At the time, it was handwritten records that I was begging contractors to give me. And so why does good data matter? I've already touched on this. We really know the solutions by now in the United States and across the country. Wildlife crossings are kind of it. You know, there's some other ones that I'm going to talk about, but we know what to do. We know how to size them and locate them. We just don't know where to put them right now if we don't have good data. So in a lot of other states that have made headway on this topic, they have really good data. They use apps, or they have wildlife agencies that are collecting this data. And so getting that carcass removal data in our state is what I think was a good way to figure this out and get things done. Oh, I didn't turn that on. Yes, collecting carcass removal data is what we're focusing on. So we developed this app. I didn't have to really invent an app. I just had to populate it with the questions. This is using Survey 123, which is a popular Esri tool that really anyone can fairly easily do, and then switch the questions out. So we did a lot of work working with VDOT staff, the maintenance staff, to say, we want you to implement this, and we want your contractors to use this app. So how can it help you? Because if it doesn't help them, they're not going to adopt it statewide. And so we worked with them a lot to create some questions. They're not all shown here, but a few questions that will help them with their invoicing and help them know that an animal was immediately removed off the road so they can pay that extra fee to contractors. And then we created this automatic email notification so that the VDOT folks can know that the carcass was removed, and they can use that for their own tracking purposes. So what do we see on the back end? This is connected to a dashboard that anybody can see. online. Well, actually not anybody can see this. It's now public, but it's in a different form, which I'll show in a second. But this is older data. We now have over 2,500 records from just our pilot project. And we have found that true to form, we have 5 times more wildlife crash records in this data set than we had from police report data. So if you click on any of these little dots of where the carcass removals were, it'll give you all kinds of information on the location and the type of animal from this drop-down list that they have to select from. And so we have it now in 3 districts. We have 9 districts in VDOT, so 3 of 9 districts are using this, and we are going to keep spreading it. So we're making really good headway. It doesn't look like there's a ton of roads on here yet, but we're going to get there. And I do have to say it's really only for interstate maintenance contractors. So all of our interstates and a lot of our primaries are contracted out. A lot of other roads, VDOT staff do. So I don't have permission for the VDOT staff to use the app for various reasons, just the contract maintenance staff. So anyone can access the data. It's public on Virginia roads. So you can Google Virginia roads or use this link. And then if you just type in the little search box, wildlife carcass, the VDOT wildlife carcass removal tracking app will come up. And when you click on that, it doesn't look like there's a ton of dots, but when you zoom in on any of these highways, there's a lot of them. So we have great data at certain locations, but again, it's going to spread across the state if I have anything to do about it. You are able to filter based on the date or the mile marker, however you want to filter it. You can download all of it, you can download some of it, and you can upload it to GIS, create a shapefile, or just download it to Excel and do whatever you want with it for any particular project or curiosity you have. So this is one example of using the data. We have on Afton Mountain a group that's part of the Virginia Safe Wildlife Corridors Collaborative that is looking at Afton Mountain, because we do know that there's really no existing underpasses and certainly no wildlife crossings designed for wildlife between, I'd say, Crozet and Waynesboro. So there's no way for wildlife to cross that road safely. We have a ton of bear crashes there. We now know from great research in Virginia Tech that bobcats is a barrier for bobcat movement and probably a lot of other animals. So this kind of data, we happen to have good carcass removal data here on this section, and this can be used for what we're hoping for is a feasibility study for wildlife crossings here. So there are some folks looking into the costs and feasibility and different aspects of actually implementing something here where the crash hotspots are highest. Oops. So now I'm just diving into some of the research. I will talk briefly about changeable message signs and animal detection systems. And then the real meat of this is the wildlife crossings and fencing. So changeable message signs just look something like this. You see them all the time. And we studied what would happen if we put an animal warning message seasonally. We wouldn't want them every night because we would want to not have habituation be a factor, just like people habituate to those yellow static warning signs that don't do any good. We thought if it's seasonal, only when the deer crashes are highest. And again, we used deer in this case. And even then, only every other night, then what would happen? Is it going to reduce crashes? How are drivers going to respond? So we took that section between Charlottesville and Afton, and we studied what drivers would do on the nights that these signs were implemented just during October and November, because about half of all deer crashes in Virginia happen in October and November, and most of them happen between 5 p.m. and 9 a.m. So we had these, here's some more examples of the signage that we used and the wording that we used on these structures, or on the changeable message signs at, I believe it was 5 different locations on that stretch of I-64. So on the nights that these signs were up, it actually did result in a deer crash reduction of 51%, which is pretty sizable. So I can't promise that that would be reproduced everywhere. I do have pretty good faith in this data, but it can be, I would imagine, very variable in other locations. But we do know that driver speed was reduced, sometimes only half a mile. But maybe with that reduction just came with more vigilance. So people just paying better attention and ready to press that brake if they needed to. So that is one method that we have on hand if wildlife crossings are not an option. And then we have animal detection driver warning systems. So these have been studied kind of piecemeal in different parts of the country, and they are still considered experimental for the most part, at least by VDOT. So we studied these we worked with Virginia Tech at 2 different locations and really determined that they can be reliable in detecting animals. But in order to really tell if they reduce crashes over time, you have to just study them for years, and we did not have that time span. So all we know is that they can be reliable if you set them up correctly and maintain them, which can be kind of complicated. And we did see that 80% of drivers either press that brake, you could see the brake lights in the video monitoring we did, or they reduced their speed in response to the sign activation. I didn't even tell you how they work. So this system that we used was a cable that was buried alongside the road. And it distributes radio frequency signals that can detect a large animal. And you can set it so that it doesn't detect every mouse that goes by. And then once it detects something, you can set it up with flashing warning lights, or even in vehicle driver systems, which would be a possibility in the future. And then hopefully the drivers will respond to those flashing warning lights on a sign. So I'll just conclude with we have this as an option that VDOT is still exploring, especially with this elk population in Southwest Virginia right now, but it's not something that has been actually put up anywhere in the state yet. So now with wildlife crossings and fencing, we have different photos of great crossing structures. Most of these are out west. I think the overpass on the right might even be in Canada. But the one on the bottom left is in Fairfax County Parkway. That's one of the 2 large overpass structures we have in Virginia that was designed for wildlife. And it's great. We had cameras monitoring it, and it's very successful. But yeah, you can have all sizes. Anything that's, again, large enough for a deer or bear can be used by lots of other species. Or you can have tiny culverts that are just large enough for a salamander. And we actually do have a salamander crossings under Polo Grounds Road in Charlottesville. And there's about 3 of them with a little bitty fencing so that if these spotted salamanders hit it, it'll lead them to these small structures to cross over Polo Grounds Road. It's pretty cool. And then this is not Virginia, this is Australia, but just to show that you can have all kinds of creative solutions. These are crabs in Australia, a way that they can cross over the highway. So it's gotten a lot of media attention, especially in the past few years. This is a New York Times did this really cool story map online showing videos of animals using structures. The Washington Post has covered it. It just seems to always be in the media because why wouldn't anybody like these things? In LA, you might have heard of a humongous underpass that's under construction right now going over, I think it's 9 or 10 lanes of highway and a $90-something million. But they raised the money for it, and it's happening for mountain lions that are very isolated and kind of genetically in trouble out there. And then there's smaller species that don't get as much attention. You can really do this for any size animal. Aquatic connectivity is also a big concern. VDOT had a big win recently with getting money to upsize a small culvert that was really hard for some anadromous fish species to pass through. So they're going to be reconstructing a culvert to make it larger to connect the aquatic connectivity, which is pretty exciting. So these are the 2 existing structures in Virginia that were designed for wildlife. Only 2 large ones that we have, and they've been up for quite a while now. One is in Route 17 near the Great Dismal Swamp National Wildlife Refuge, and this was constructed to span a wetland, but they kind of elongated it and made a dry passage area for black bears because there's a fairly isolated black bear population out there. And then the Fairfax County Parkway one is in a very heavily trafficked area, but you get all kinds of species moving through there. So it's a really well done large box culvert. So we know that it's pretty expensive to design these structures. I have a little information on that later, to construct new structures. But we have a ton of bridges, hundreds of thousands of them in the US that span water like rivers or streams, or even large existing box culverts that we can really make better use of by enhancing them with wildlife fencing. Because any good structure, let's see, an image of it here. Any good wildlife crossing structure has fencing associated with it. So the idea is the fencing will help funnel the wildlife towards the structure if they go the right way. And I think research has shown that animals will continue using a structure, go out of their way to use it once they learn that it's there. And so we wanted to put wildlife fencing up on a couple existing structures to figure out whether it would increase the use of the structures by all kinds of animals. So again, this is I-64 in the same area. We did a lot of research here because there was one VDOT person who was really into this whole concept of reducing wildlife crashes. And as I've heard my friend Patty Kramer say to me before, it often takes 1 or 2 people to make a huge difference. And this particular person, you know, he supported all of our research, and so we did it in the area that he was interested in, and he oversees this section of I-64. So we looked at these 2 structures. One is a large box culvert that was built when the highway was constructed. At the time it was built to connect a farm, so they had cattle pass through the structure. And the other is a bridge over Meachams River over near Crozet. And so for 2 years, we put cameras alongside the road to look at the behavior of animals, to figure out how many animals are alongside the road and potentially crossing the road, even though the structure is right beneath them. And we put cameras up to 1 mile at each site, so ½ mile on either side of the structures. And we also had cameras in the structures themselves. And so these are photos of animals and their behavior along the roadside. So we would document all aspects of the behavior. Were they crossing? Were the animals grazing, which deer do all the time? Most of their behavior is grazing or walking along the road and looking at it, at the road, potentially looking for a place to cross. So we have fox, coyotes, a turkey, and bear in those pictures. And then this is a photo from the box culvert. We documented deer hesitancy behavior, which muzzle to the ground, not sure about the structure. They really didn't love the structure because it's long and it's a dark, scary tunnel. So about 1/3 of them would actually turn back around and decide not to use it, and then probably came up to the road and tried to cross there before there was fencing. So then we constructed 8 feet high fencing. We know that deer will not jump over something that's 8 feet high, 8 feet tall. And this is just an image of the fencing with the culvert right in the middle. And then we also put jump out structures. So if an animal gets trapped in the road on the wrong side of the fencing, they need a way to jump out. So this was a design by Georgia researchers who thought that this could be effective. We monitored it. It does seem to be effective. They can jump out, but because there's this angled attachment, they don't want to jump into the road to the wrong side of the fence. So we have those structures along the fencing, and we compared the pre-fencing roadside activity and underpass use to the post-fencing roadside activity and underpass use. So we found a 92% average deer crash reduction, which was huge. And also, we didn't have enough bear crashes in those spans to have a significant finding from that one way or the other. But we did have over $2 million savings per site when you look at the property damage reduction versus the cost of the fencing. And there were no increase in wildlife crashes at those fence ends. We really studied what was happening at the fence ends. But if you tie the fence ends in with existing topography that is too steep for animals to go around, or there's other ways of doing it that really discourages animals from going around those fence ends, it really helps to not just have them come and cross the road at the end of the fencing. So that was incredibly great. This is the kind of numbers that VDOT wants to hear in order to really encourage them to do more of this stuff. And then this is just a fun video of deer and fawn using the structure. And we got pictures and videos like this all the time of animals with their young using the crossings. So there's a lot of great teaching behavior there. And this is a real short one, but so many bobcats use this structure. I'll play it again because it's so short, but I think they really like the fact that it's kind of smaller and dark. They probably feel safer than a huge open underpass. So black bears never used this structure before we had fencing, and I had older camera research at this spot. I had the more recent camera research at the spot. They had never used it. They came up to it and would walk away. But once we had fencing, let's see. No, it's not going to play. Once we have fencing, we're now getting, let's see, I think we had a dozen the first year, black bears using it. This is a big one. And I think we probably had over 20 3 years later. So it's pretty fantastic. They're realizing that they just can't easily go over the road, that they're going to have to use the structure if they want to cross. That was very exciting to see the first black bear use that thing. So a 420% increase in use of the structures by deer once there was fencing. And with all the other mammals, it averaged 165% increase in use. So super cheap method, really effective. They did do this on 81 after they saw the success of this project. We now have it on 81 under, I think in VDOT's Bristol area. And hopefully it will spread to additional locations. So implementation in VDOT. So we do have fencing information now in a guidance manual of large animal crash countermeasures. We provide guidance on how to design the fencing and a couple other measures to increase, like to enhance existing structures, such as creating a trail. So this lower picture, I think this is from Minnesota, but it's just a dry path through riprap. There's a lot of times where there's just riprap for erosion control under bridges that are near streams and rivers, and hoofed animals especially cannot get through them. So doing something simple like creating a path. There's some more erosion control types of methods that you need to figure out and have guidance for, which is in this VDOT's bridge manual. Our large animal crash countermeasures document, it talks about wildlife crossings, designing a crossing alone and with fencing, or enhancing a structure with fencing. And we also do talk about the changeable message signs and animal detection systems, which, like I said, are still used on an experimental basis. And we also do recommend that if VDOT is using police report data for their safety analyses, that for deer crashes, they multiply that by a factor of 5 to get a more accurate count of the actual number of crashes. So Jess has probably talked about this before if you've attended her great webinars, but the Virginia Wildlife Corridor Action Plan, I think between our State Wildlife Corridor Collaborative and research that's been done in the state, it made it kind of a ripe state to create a Virginia Wildlife Corridor Action Plan and have it passed. And this was very successful and very impactful legislation that tasked these various agencies to identify wildlife corridors in the state, wildlife crash hotspots, and then actually prioritize locations for wildlife crossings. And then related legislation was built on that for agencies to incorporate the recommendations from the Wildlife Corridor Action Plan into their planning process. And this is my last slide on the Wildlife Corridor Action Plan, but it was released last May, and it's supposed to be updated every 4 years. So we've already started working on the updates for that. So it had kind of a driver safety component of finding the crash hotspots, and wildlife corridors were identified using Department of Conservation and Recreations. They had they created a map, or used a map that had already been partially created of kind of large scale wildlife crossings. And then they created what they referred to as nexus areas. So they didn't actually find or prioritize wildlife crossing specific locations, but found 26 nexus areas of areas that the wildlife corridors overlapped with the wildlife crash hotspots. And basically, because so much more research was needed to really figure out where wildlife crossings could go, the agencies didn't have time to find all the data and collect all the data needed to actually prioritize locations. So the priorities for the next version, which will be due in a few years, does include finding specific wildlife crossing locations, but also identifying high-risk road sections for small animals, because right now the only data we had was police report data at the time for deer and bear to some extent. And then we're also going to kind of redo the crash analysis so that it has a predictive component of, what are the landscape and road variables that are associated with these animal crashes, so that we can kind of better plan and prepare for new projects. And it will also have a public involvement component, which will be very important. So I'm working on the first two of those bullets right there. I'm kind of leading the way and working with a couple other folks on doing those high-risk road and hotspot maps. So now how are we doing on time, Jess? This is not a long part. We're good? Okay.
Yes.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about elk in Southwest Virginia. A lot of people don't even know that there's an elk population down there. They're still pretty relatively new to this state. But I worked on this study. We wrapped it up last year with the Wildlands Network and our Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources. And then Renee Callahan worked on the funding component from ARC Solutions. So this is a road that is still under construction. Some of it's under construction. Some of it just opened last fall, but it's a 14-mile section in Buchanan County, Virginia, which was a huge coal mining town. And the orange line is Corridor Q, and it's part of the Appalachian Highway Development System, which was planned in Congress in the 60s. It's been forever in the making, and it's still kind of ongoing construction, but it's to promote economic development in pretty impoverished areas. And it's going to be a pretty low volume road. This section here was opened in 2020. A 1-mile section was opened a few years ago. And then last November, I think it was, they opened the next 8-mile section. And then the next sections are open in 2025 and 2027. So when we did the study, it was right before it opened to traffic in 2023. So the DWR, Department of Wildlife Resources, relocated 75 elk from a Kentucky population to Buchanan County. And that was up to 2014. And since then, in just 10 years, the population is at least 250. And most of them do live in Buchanan County. And DWR is keeping them within a 3-county area. So they did, I think a year and a half ago, open it up to a small amount of hunting. I think 5 per year, so something like that, were allowed to be hunted or taken. So this elk has been just a huge hit for the local economy and tourism. Buchanan County just loves them. There's elk viewing web cameras and viewing platforms. The hunt lottery raised over $500,000 in the first year, 2 years ago, for DWR. So even though they just sold 5 tags, they raised over $500,000 in just the lottery for getting those tags. So it's important to the state and to the economy in that area. So what I'm going to call the Corridor Q herd, because that's what DWR calls it, these elk really moved in during the construction of this road. And it just happened to be that they were at the wrong place at the wrong time, or maybe the road was at the wrong place at the wrong time. But they love the road, they live on it and next to it. And VDOT recognized this is a real problem, and what can we do about it? And so it's easy to see how big elk are with this image. They're much bigger than deer. They create more injuries in a crash than deer do. And elk crashes are higher at lower traffic volumes. That's an important point here, because in Arizona, they've done a lot of research on a couple highways that were similar in traffic volume to what this road is expected to be. And so if it's a really high traffic volume, elk tend to avoid the road altogether, but the sweet spot is about what we expect in the traffic volume, 5,000 to 6,000 vehicles per day. So we're looking at some problems here. Here's a whole big herd of them. And it's these kind of pictures that led VDOT to ask for help about what to do. So we did, I'm going a little ahead of myself here, but I'm not getting into the methods. I'm just going to dive right into the findings here. This is pictures of the elk and why they love the road so much. VDOT has to immediately cover any steep slopes with vegetation so that it's not an erosion problem. And the elk love this vegetation. And we found a lot of the elk were collared. We have about 12 elk that are collared. DWR had collared them years ago. So we used their collars and their location data to do a habitat suitability study, and found that distance to barren land, which is like bare road, herbaceous cover, like the roadside grass, and shrub cover, which the National Land Cover data reads kind of as newly emergent vegetation. After you have construction, it looks like kind of shrubby stuff that comes up. So everything that is associated with road construction is stuff that the elk absolutely love. Yeah, that slide was put a little bit early, but the purpose of our study was to look at the design of wildlife crossings, placement options for them, and the costs and funding opportunities for them if VDOT decides to construct wildlife crossings, or if anyone decides to construct wildlife crossings. I think they wanted to be armed with this information in case they decided to put them up or funding became available. So this is the only section I'm going into the methods, but we divided this whole corridor into half-mile segments and evaluated them for this list of criteria. Most of it was based on the elk location data from the collared elk. They do live in herds, so we had 12 collared, but we could assume that most of those elk were running around together. But we looked at all of these other factors and also considered wildlife crossing spacing. So if we have multiple wildlife crossings, what's the ideal spacing? What are the size criteria that have worked for elk in other states? And this is their home range results right here. And you can see that each of these home ranges is really shaped like the road itself, at least the road that was already mostly constructed at the time we did this study. So the locations are on the right. Those are almost 27,000 GPS locations. And all 12 elk that were collared used the road and used almost all of the road. And what was interesting is that these corridor Q elk had a really huge home range compared to the nearby elk herd. They kind of separated into two herds. So corridor Q elk, there were about 100 of them. And then 7 miles, I believe, south of there was a smaller elk herd with much smaller home ranges. And it was very evident that the road itself became this super easy path for them to travel, so they could travel longer distances to access the food that they wanted. So just like we use roads for easy travel, they were doing the same thing, and it affected their home range size and makes them more at risk, obviously, for crashes. So we also looked at the topography. We did a lot of site visits. These cut sections of the road were really kind of ideal for overpass designs, where you can just kind of place that overpass right on top of these foundations that were already there. And then the fill sections could be kind of dug underneath for underpasses. There's a photo of that. So this is kind of the final image. So we found suitable locations for 10 structures. 2 overpasses is what we kind of thought would be appropriate, and 8 underpass structures. Elk do use both types, and underpasses might be slightly less expensive, but probably easier to construct in this location. And we found that a distance of no more than 1.5 miles between each structure would be appropriate, because we don't want the fencing between the structures, and you would have to have fencing between the structures. We didn't want that spacing to be so long that other animals couldn't reach a structure because the fencing was like 5 miles long. So the UP here is underpass, OP is overpass, and the different colors represent kind of the elk location data and habitat suitability data. I didn't want to get too in the weeds with this, but we did find great suitable locations for structures if VDOT decided to go that route. So we also looked at how many crashes would be needed to offset the cost. And I'm almost done here with this, Jess. So the cost would be about $5.5 million for each structure. And the benefit, so any avoided elk and deer crash, elk crashes are averaged at 81,000, deer 41,000. So it would take 2.8 elk crashes or 5.4 deer crashes per structure per year that would need to be avoided to make up for the cost of the structure. The only comparison that we really could find was in Arizona. They did find elk crash reductions after they put up wildlife crossings of over 4 following wildlife crossing and fencing constructions. So those are larger populations, but then again, those populations don't live on the road like these elk do. So that information we gave to VDOT, and Oops, I didn't even show that. I'm sorry. I'm looking at the wrong screen here. So yes, we have pretty good evidence to think that these structures would likely pay for themselves over time. And Renee Callahan of ARC Solutions has a great online tool that shows all of the federal funding opportunities for structures. There's 1 or 2 more pages in addition to this, but we did a deep dive into what the best funding opportunities would be. So all of that is on hand for VDOT or anyone else to use to try to get funding for a structure. And that's kind of where it stands right now. Nothing is planned necessarily, but perhaps plans are in the works by other outside organizations to try to find funding for that. So yes, I'm talking about you, Jess. So yeah, we've got great research on this whole topic in the US and lots of research in Virginia. We know how structures should be designed. We know how to find good locations for them. We know how to enhance existing structures, but implementation is the hard part. And in my view, much of this is because at the moment, everything is kind of optional in Virginia. There's no requirements for wildlife crossing construction. There's not requirements that all of VDOT use the app to collect carcass removal data. And so this makes it easier for VDOT, other priorities and requirements that VDOT has, and there's many, it makes it easier for those to rise to the top. So the way a state agency spends its money is really complicated and quite political. I'm speaking now as a citizen and not a VDOT employee because it's after 5 o'clock and I'm off the clock. But I have found that organizations outside of VDOT have the biggest impact in creating a voice and expectations, and taking the research that we've done and other steps forward that VDOT has done, taking that and use it to create kind of a shift in thinking within our state organizations. So these outside groups are setting those expectations because that's what the public and a growing number of legislators are asking for. So the work that Jess and other groups I imagine are on this call are doing is kind of everything for our state. But I do have huge hope that Virginia is getting close to getting the next project off the ground and then creating a snowball effect of additional projects once that happens. And I guarantee the way that'll get done is collaborative efforts from people like those of you. And then, those of us working from the inside and able to provide research findings. So that's all I have.
Yay, amazing. Thank you so much, Bridget. I mean, you took the words right out of my mouth. If you'd like to get more involved with more advocacy efforts and how you can put pressure on your legislators to get more money and resources for the Virginia Department of Transportation to put these crossings in place, but also to get more stringent language in our laws that say that for our VDOT needs to have wildlife crossings and corridors be considered for all their infrastructure projects. Again, go to wildvirginia.org and follow us, get on our listserv so you can be involved in all of our actions to get all this put in place. So right before we start with questions, again, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A section. We already have a bunch coming in, but you can put that in right now. I'm going to share my screen real fast to show you on Virginia's Habitat Connectivity Hub, where you can find all this information that Bridget just talked about, and also more information on wildlife crossings and corridors, so you can be as knowledgeable as possible in the future with your own advocacy efforts. So I'm going to share my screen real fast. All right, just real fast. Okay. So this is Virginia's Habitat Connectivity Hub. We put it in the chat. If you came in late and it's not in the chat, we'll put it in just a second. But this is what you see when you come to Virginia's Habitat Connectivity Hub. We have a navigation bar at the top if you want to go to more general topics. But then we also have a topic-based table of contents that lets you skip to certain topics really quickly. So where do I find information on wildlife vehicle conflict in Virginia? Bridget talked a lot about the Wildlife Corridor Action Plan. You can get a great description of this information by clicking this link. Her carcass removal data is also linked directly in the Habitat Connectivity Hub, so you can actually interact with this data in real time. So it gets updated with all of her updates as well. Also gives another brief introduction to the carcass removal app and some of the stuff that you can do with it. If we go back to our table of contents, you can also go to the section that says, where can I find information on the impact of wildlife conflict mitigation? So we have a whole section on wildlife crossing research, which pretty much is dominated by all of Bridget's wonderful research she just talked about in this section. But we have the underpasses that we talked about. You can skip to, you can see where they are, all the different types of information, cute videos of animals using the passage as well. But this section just has all different types of crossing research in Virginia. So her underpasses, but also the salamander tunnels she talked about. You can find some bridges in, here's our salamander tunnels, or salamander tunnel section. You can learn all about this project and who ran it. And then also at the end, her research on the elk project she talked about as well. Get to that real fast. There it is, our elk project right here. And all the links to her studies that she talked about today are actually in the hub as well. If you go to the end of each section, you can find a link to her studies if you want to read them in more depth. And we also have a bunch of different initiatives on the hub that you can look into as well, including a aquatic organism passage section. Bridget mentioned briefly about culvert replacements for aquatic organism passage. You can learn all about that as well on the hub. So again, this is our hub highlights series. The point of this is to teach you how to use Virginia's Habitat Connectivity Hub to become better informed about wildlife crossings in Virginia. Awesome. Okay. So we're going to start off with questions. We had one question in the chat real fast that asked, can you talk about how you got to the 41,000 per deer crash cost? Like what kind of went into that? Yeah.
Yes, that was per crash cost, not, that didn't have to do with removing the carcass. Yeah, so VDOT has a method of valuing crashes of all types. And for that, they use police report data to determine the severity of that crash type. And then just they weight it based on the severity. So each severity of a crash is assigned a value that VDOT uses. And that it's comprehensive cost too. So it considers like loss of time from work and all kinds of factors. But it's what's important is that it's what VDOT uses in their other types of crashes. So we just applied that same method to the deer crashes that were in police reports. And so the biggest cost is if you have one fatality, that's millions of dollars of value. Don't ask me exactly how they decide to value that, but that can make a huge difference to the overall cost, and injuries is also huge. So we're following VDOT's methodology based on crash severity for that.
Awesome. Thank you. And then we have a few in the Q&A. So first one asked, did you say that there was an underpass or fencing in Afton or not yet?
Yeah, there's not, right. So there's a group kind of trying to look into it and figure out how do we even begin looking into something like this. And so far the headway that's been made is talking to a consulting firm to get costs for a feasibility study to figure out what would it cost to like tunnel under 64, because I guarantee VDOT is not going to dig up 64 and reroute traffic, but there's tunneling agencies. So what would it cost to do that? Or yeah, there's really no fencing that is, or I'm sorry, there's no underpass structure that's large enough really for any animal because it's such a long span, and right now there's just a couple long drainage structures. So it would cost, you know, a few or several $1,000,000 probably for even one box culvert or something that's large enough to pass bear, but nothing's there yet.
Awesome. And then next one, how can we collect info on animal crashes and feed it into DWR?
That's a great question. And there's apps now that make it easy to do that, but it'll take some individual initiative. Actually, just help me out here. Who is Virginia Land, Liz Fairbanks works for them, and she helps with app stuff like that. The land conservation, I can connect you with the name once I figure it out. But there's a woman who works for an organization out west that does, she helped us in Albemarle County. The county, someone in the county wanted to collect data on I-20, on Route 29. And so this woman used the same Survey 123 app that we have, and she just put the questions on there. And usually it's like 2 questions: what kind of animal? And it's automatically geolocated. So she helped with that. But if you know what you're doing enough, you can find an app to do that yourself. But there's really no formal method to do this. And honestly, it's not DWR that necessarily collects it, and it's not VDOT that necessarily collects it. We're kind of in this space of who would get that data, and how would you verify the accuracy of that data. I think sometimes there's folks that think that public data collection systems might not be as accurate, which I don't think is true. Why would VDOT staff or contract staff be any more accurate? But there's not a systematic method for the public right now to collect that kind of data. I wish there was an easy answer. But if you want to email me, I can provide you probably a more intelligent solution and some contacts that might help. Not intelligent solution, intelligent answer. I think it's a really great idea to collect that kind of data at a local level. And especially if you think that there's any state listed or federally listed species, that DWR will definitely listen to that and probably know how to respond. But otherwise, yeah, feel free to send me an email and we can chat more.
Yeah, and we have if you go also, just to plug the hub again, if you go to county initiatives, the project in Albemarle that Bridget was just talking about is on there, and their data that they actually collected from their citizen science initiative is on there as well. And then we also have a program, sort of this like pilot program in Loudoun County, that's a partnership between DWR and William and Mary. And they actually had this app created, and then this sort of systematic way of collecting wildlife interactions with roads, and their data is also displayed on the hub under county initiatives. So a little bit more of a pilot program, but there is interest to expand that to other counties. We just need the funding in order to do so, which is a lot of the work that we do here at Wild Virginia, trying to get that funding for projects like this. So awesome. And then, okay, we have another one. This is the one we always get. Have you tried working with insurance companies for them to help pay for costs of under and overpasses? That's a good question.
Yeah, the one answer that I have heard that somebody has spoken with insurance folks is that, you know, I don't think they necessarily dole out money in the form of a chunk of money for a wildlife crossing. They'll dole it out in terms of increasing the costs for the drivers. So whenever they have a big crash type, they just kind of put that in their algorithm for figuring out how to charge people more money. I do think insurance folks have been approached before, probably not in Virginia, and it would be beyond kind of my research bounds in a state agency to do that. But it is a great idea, and I would think for the PR alone, a smart insurance agency would want the name of an overpass, you know, their name on an overpass or underpass. But yeah, I've not heard of one case where they've provided funds.
Yeah, and then we have another one on our chat that says, have we used Waze? And I think we've talked about this before. We're like a little bit worried people are double clicking for the same animal.
For using Waze to collect this data. Yeah, I think Waze even has, they used to, I looked into this a little while ago, a button where you can report seeing a live animal or a dead animal, or and we did look into that actually, and we compared those data with police report data and the carcass removal data I had at the time. And there were just some discrepancies. And part of that may be that you're on the road, and if you report it a half mile down, you know, if you're a passenger and you push the button a half mile down, that throws everything off, and you have to get a really specific location when you're talking about, you know, where to mitigate something. And so it gets a little tricky when you're using something while you're driving, as opposed to when you're standing there and removing it. But it's better than nothing. It's just really hard to figure out how to incorporate that and how to know how accurate that is.
Yeah, that's great. And just another sort of thing that we're working on in the mix myself at Wild Virginia is we're trying to hook in wildlife rehabilitation center data for smaller critters who get in wildlife that have been hit by cars, and then they actually have location data. So that's something that we're trying to put on the hub in the future for the little guys. And then we have another question. Will any of these recommendations be made available to developers when new roads are being proposed? Example, major infrastructure redesigns in Northern Virginia.
Yeah, that is a really, that's come up and it's actually happened before, but probably not by VDOT, because the whole topic of wildlife crossings by VDOT is just not something that's been adopted yet, unfortunately. I'm probably making it seem like this is an accepted practice, but it's not. And that's why folks like justice groups are so important. So VDOT does not talk to developers. But there is the reason the salamander crossing in Charlottesville is there is because it was someone from the Center of Urban Landscapes. So an environmental nonprofit organization talked to the developer and said, hey, there's a salamander population here. The developer was wiping out a bunch of trees, and the developer said, oh, this is no big deal to put some small culverts under the road, and they paid for everything. They did all of it. So sometimes it's really just a matter of asking. But yeah, getting the timing right and finding the person to ask, or finding the right, I don't know, VDOT person for me to ask to do it. I would love if there was a system of doing it. But again, I think it often comes down to the public knowing what, that person knew that there was a salamander population there that I had no idea. And I live in Charlottesville. So that's where the public and community come in.
Yeah. And so again, if you are interested in getting involved in more advocacy side of this to get funding and to push VDOT for more of these projects to be put in place, again, please go to wildvirginia.org. You can sign up for our action alerts through our listserv. And believe me, it's getting real busy soon. We're going to have a lot of action alerts coming up for the next following year to get more of these crossings and projects put in place. But I think we're at time. So thank you so much to Bridget for giving us her time and her efforts and showing us all the wonderful work she does in Virginia. We will send a follow-up email with the hub and some links to the work that she described so you can learn more on your own. But again, feel free, if you want more information on this type of work, go to wildvirginia.org and we can give you everything that you need. But thank you so much, Bridget.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's been fun.
Have a great evening. Yeah, see you guys. Thank you, Kylie, for your help.
Of course. Good night.
Good night. Bye, Bridget.
Bye-bye.